Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Will internationalism, institutions like the UN, and global commitments to democracy and human rights survive if America says it just doesn't care anymore? Let's get to the bottom line. When the West, led by the United States, played architect to build a vast array of international institutions to promote justice, liberal democracy, open markets, and prevent another global war, that's what the world got. We built the United Nations, we built NATO, the IMF and World Bank, the International Energy Agency, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization. I could go on and on and on. But those days may be over. At this year's Munich Security Conference, the world's most important convening of national security strategists and leaders, a term was born. It's called Westlessness, a world where the United States and the West are ambivalent towards the global order and towards global problem solving. So we have to ask today, do international law and cooperation still matter? How relevant is the UN? How is a world without leadership supposed to respond to things like the spread of the coronavirus, refugees fleeing wars, and natural disasters? Fortunately, we have some people with us here who have all the answers. With me here in Washington, D.C. are Danielle Pletka, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and host of a weekly podcast on global affairs called What the Hell is Going On? And Ian Bremmer, the president of the Eurasia Group, a consultancy that focuses on political risk around the world, and author of Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. And in Berlin, Germany, we have Wolfgang Ischinger, former German ambassador to the United States and the United Kingdom, and now chairman of the Munich Security Conference. It's so great to have all of you here today. This is a big, heavy subject. And Wolfgang, I'm going to start with you after the successful conference you just had. But you laid out this question about what is the world without the West, essentially, at the front leading to solve problems. So what is your diagnosis of the global order as we see it today?
Well, Steve, first of all, let me say how great it is to be on your show and to talk about these very important issues for the international community and for us, the West. Now, what we believed, my team and I, what we believed we can diagnose is a double phenomenon. First, that the West, as we know it, is beginning to become less Western, and that the world at large that we thought would, over time, become more Western, would join us, the liberal international order. Actually, we diagnose that the world at large is not becoming more Western, it's becoming less Western. So we have a double loss. That was our diagnosis, and that's how we try to coin this term, Westlessness. And I have to say that as a conference convener, I'm very happy that the term created quite a bit of controversy. Some people almost violently disagreed. Others thought it was right on the mark. And we had a lot of debate, good debate, tough debate about where the West stands and whether, in fact, we should be worried. And I think I am worried.
Danny, are you worried?
I am, and it's for a lot of the reasons that Wolfgang outlined. You know, it's always been the case that there's a competition of ideas that goes on. It's not that, we are out there and that there aren't countervailing forces. And what's happened over the last 20, 30 years since the end of the Cold War is that we've kind of rested on our laurels. We've said, well, we won, that's great, game over. And at the same time, we've seen powers rising that are inimical to us. And by this, I mean less Russia, although we talk a lot about Russia in Europe, and at the Munich Security Conference, they did talk a lot about Russia, but really also China. And one power that I think is ignored in the development world, and one that my colleague Karen Young writes about a lot, which is the Gulf. If you look at all the initials that you laid out in the introduction, the WHO and the UN and the World Bank and the IMF, they have a model of development that rests on accountability, regulation, transparency, a sort of a liberal order, and in many ways a liberal economic order. What the Chinese are exporting with Belt and Road, and what we don't talk about as much, but what the Gulf countries are exporting with their own economic statecraft is not that model.
So what went wrong? Because part of the deal, I've read what you've written in the past about the fact that these institutions and of global order and global problem solving began letting nations in that weren't democracies, that didn't have the DNA of legal systems and systems of justice and rights, and that has had a corrosive effect on those institutions. So, but I think a lot of other people thought China and Russia bringing them in would change those countries.
Right.
But it seems to have gone the other way around.
Right, that was the conceit of the opening to China, and I don't think we should denigrate that. It probably was one of the most transformative events in human history. Hundreds of millions of people raised out of poverty after the opening of China. The problem was that the notion, the conceit was that we would entangle these powers in this global set of rules and systems and guardrails.
Right.
And the answer is, well, actually, no. What they've done is they've taken advantage, they've exploited those systems, and we've allowed a lot of these institutions that were built up in the wake of World War II to age, kind of like me. I always use the example. I'm an older lady. I don't do the things I need to change, and yet those institutions haven't adapted.
Ian, you've talked about Westlessness. I know you were at the Munich Security Conferences. A lot of this also rides very closely to another term you had of a G0 world. Zbig Brzezinski used to talk about the need for a G2 world, the United States and China, that if we couldn't get the U.S. and China together, nothing could be done. But I'm interested in your take on Westlessness, G0dom, what it means.
Yeah, it's clear the G2 isn't happening, right? So why are we in this period of profound lack of leadership? We feel unmoored, and Munich Security Conference, which is meant to be the place where the transatlantic alliance comes together to talk about combined views of security, suddenly feels like it's not working out that way at all. And Wolfgang is right. It was very controversial at the conference.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo got up and said, the West has never been better, right?
Yeah, there was
we're
a
winning.
full-on
The West
9
is winning.
from Mike. I mean, that's pretty clear. The Germans were much more, I think, concerned and recognized that Wolfgang got it right. Look, I think there are 3 major reasons for it. Number 1, China is rising but not aligning towards us. Russia's in decline, really angry about it, blaming us and working to undermine us. So geopolitically, things that we thought were going to feel like they were close and increasingly Western haven't worked. Secondly, inside our own countries, we have larger numbers of people that feel like the system does not work for them. It's delegitimized. It's why you have Trump. It's why you have Sanders. It's why you have Brexit. It's why you have the Gilets jaunes. It's why you have the AfD, the Alternatives for Deutschland in Germany. I mean, on and on and on, right? But then thirdly, and having less to do with the internal and the geopolitical, it's just the institutional. And that gets to what Danielle just said, which is when we create these institutions, they actually reflect the geopolitical order, balance, values, capital of the time. Times change, but the institutions frequently don't. We put the UN together in 1945. Literally in 1947, the Security Council no longer made sense. We had the Berlin crisis, the blockade, and we're thinking to ourselves, why the hell did we let the Soviets in with the permanent veto? Sadly, too late. There they are. And ever since then, the Security Council's kind of been broken, can't reform it. Now, when you talk about NATO and the World Trade Organization, it took a long time before the geopolitics shifted so much that the institutions felt irrelevant.
Right.
But now in 2020, hey, surprise, surprise, a lot of these institutions don't remotely reflect the geopolitical realities of those first 2 points. And as a consequence, the institutions are kind of broken, and you increasingly see Belt and Road. You increasingly see new sorts of institutions that are rising that have very little to do with the West as we historically defined it.
Wolfgang Ischinger, one of the things I love about your profile is that you're not only this impresario of global strategists, but you were ambassador of Germany to the United Kingdom and to the United States. And I think one of the questions is, has this pugnacious nationalism, has this disregard for the international deal-making and rule-making that I see in the United States today, has that been cooking up for a while in places like the UK and the US? Did you see precursors to this before Donald Trump?
Well, I think yes, in very different ways. I mean, we have seen, for example, the beginning of an American tendency not to play the world's only policeman, to withdraw where that was compatible with what the United States defined as the priority interest. We saw that with before Donald Trump. We saw it with President Obama. So for from a European point of view, you know, we in Europe, we are all small countries on the world scale. None of us has 100 million or more inhabitants. We're all small. If you're small, you like strong institutions. If you're small, you like established and accepted rules that work, because that protects usually the small. The big ones, the United States, needs those rules a little less than the small ones. So if I can just make one point that affects my own country most, the difference between the United States and Germany is you created this liberal post-World War II international order. You created it, and you know, the world owes America a debt of gratitude. My own country was the defeated enemy at the time when the United Nations was founded. We joined the United Nations, most people forget that, only in the 1970s. We joined NATO only in the mid-1950s. And for my own country, the idea that we became part of the West has been a very principal, a very fundamental idea of our own post-war existence. When I was ambassador in Washington, I said occasionally, you know, I'm happy and confident because as the ambassador of my country, I can now say that we're actually today on the right side of history, not on the wrong side. That is why this breaking apart of the West, this loss of control by the West of global affairs, is of particularly a negative impact for Germany. We are losing a lot more than established powers like France and Britain and the United States. My generation used to believe that the center of the universe, that's the White House and Capitol Hill, looking at the world from Germany. And that is now, you know, there's now a large question mark. That's where we are at the moment.
Danny, you've spoken a lot about this. We've had a lot of conversations. How culpable are previous administrations in the United States to the state of affairs that we have today?
Look, I think we can be pretty much equal opportunity blamers. You know, when you talk about a lack of interest, for example, in rebuilding democratic institutions, in human rights, in those sorts of questions, in, you know, the ideals of what we used to call the West.
Right.
The Obama administration wasn't terribly interested, and the Obama administration was a direct repudiation of the Bush administration's so-called freedom agenda, which really put those kinds of questions front and center and revealed that while our values may have been good and well-placed, and our ambitions may have been good and well-placed, our capabilities were not, and that we are much better at winning wars than we are at winning peace. And I would go so far as to say, even in places where we haven't fought wars, but where, you know, Hosni Mubarak, for example, I was just talking about him with you a moment ago, you know, there was a situation where we almost never pressed the Egyptian leader for accountability, for fairness, for human freedom.
And we're not pressing Sisi today on those
And
issues.
Sisi is even worse. What leads us to believe that going down that same path will not, in fact, lead to the same outcome?
Ian, right now, one of the things that I have learned about global affairs, and I come at this from a realist tradition, actually, but I understand why these important transnational issues like human rights, what happens with refugees, what happens with system of justice really matter. My form of realism was apparently a lot more progressive than I had anticipated. Now you see world affairs. But I guess the question is, when we see things like the coronavirus today spread around the world, these are sort of dark day issues where nations sometimes say, you know, I wish I hadn't kicked Germany in the teeth or Canada in the teeth. When you kind of begin looking at whether or not there is a reservoir of goodwill today among countries when big transnational challenges come out. So we've got refugees, we've got coronavirus and pandemics in general. And I'm interested in how you see a way forward, or whether we find ourselves just living in an ad hoc a la carte world where sometimes we work together and the rest of the time we're not?
Well, look, there is good news. I mean, the good news
What is the
that,
good news?
Well, is that after 75 years of growing globalization, we're just a lot wealthier.
Right.
And not only are we a lot wealthier as a world, but we also have a lot more people with the education to be a part of solutions. So even though it is not unified, we have more capacity to respond to shocks, whether it's climate or it's coronavirus, right? But clearly, governance, which is what we're talking about here, the political variables are heading in a very different direction. And when we had 9/11, the United States came together. Bush's support was about 92% that January, right? And the world came together.
But there was a reservoir of goodwill.
That's
but
right.
I want to go back. I want to play
We're
a
not
clip
getting
here.
that now.
One of Danny's former colleagues, maybe current colleagues, I'm not sure, but former colleagues played a prominent role in the Trump administration. But also Bush administrations. But let's listen to John Bolton at a conference in New York in 1994.
There is no United Nations. There is an international community that occasionally can be led by the only real power left in the world, and that's the United States, when it suits our interest and when we can get others to go along. The Secretariat building in New York has 38 stories. If you lost 10 stories today, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. This kind of mindless creation of the United Nations as something different from what it's in the United States' interest to do isn't going to sell here or anywhere else. The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest. And if you don't like that, I'm sorry, but that is the fact.
So this was a long time ago. This was Ambassador John Bolton operating in a very different field that he was.
He was so much more virile then, my goodness.
But it raises an interesting question that I think gets right at this heart of the Westlessness challenge. Was if John Bolton's comment was, if the United States is engaged in leading, then operations like the United Nations can matter. If the United States is not there in doing these things, then you've basically unplugged a world that is problem solving. And I want to know where the good news is in that.
The good news is that if the geopolitics have moved so far that the old U.S.-led order can no longer hold, much better to know that early than late. Much better to actually be working on a new set of institutions that will actually reflect a functional new global order than wait until the big crisis inevitably comes.
Right.
And so, in other words, Trump being elected could be more of a call to arms for a lot of people that say, wow.
So you see a whole new world of kind of global architects.
I mean, it's going to happen eventually. The question is, how much pain, how much suffering do we need to suffer on a bunch of issues, all of which are, in front of us in the future?
I think the challenge here is when you talk about global architecture, what's wrong with a lot of these institutions is, per John Bolton of the old school, they don't actually work that well. You alluded to the dysfunction of the Security Council a mere 2 years after it was created, and nothing has really happened to fix it. We have the European Union, but we still have France on the Security Council. If you're France, you want to hang on to that. If you're the European Union, you don't really get it. But a lot of these misconnects continue to exist. And a lot of people who like these sorts of global institutions like them because they diffuse responsibility, not because they're hugely effective. If I think back over the last 70 years and I have to list the accomplishments of the United Nations, I have fewer words than I would like. The argument that you liked was the one that I made with a colleague and a friend of ours, Vikram Singh, and what we
And
argued...
Vikram Singh was at the Center for American
He's at
Progress.
the Center for American Progress, so a good left-right argument. And what we both said is part of the problem with all of these institutions, whether it's the European Union or the Community of Democracies or NATO, if you look at the challenges NATO is facing now with Turkey, if they are a one-way ratchet. They're the Harvard of institutions. Once you're in, and you don't have to do anything. And when you transgress the rules, and in many cases, these are the sort of the Western values-based, economically liberal-based rules, there's no punishment. That means that these institutions rot from within, and that goes for the EU just as much as it goes for the United Nations and others.
Ian, I want to go to the ambassador in a minute, but before that, I want to ask you about China and China's role in this. I mean, I have a lot of relatives who think America fought the Cold War and China won. and that China is riding high on the very foundation of what made this international system work and operate. Is there any chance that China will turn out to be a responsible stakeholder, in the words of Bob Zellick, who once said that China needed to stand up and become a good international, on climate change, on protecting the global market order system? Do you think there's any chance China will become responsible?
They won't in Zellick's formulation or Hillary Clinton's, and it's because their definition was that not only does China need to accept more responsibility, but they need to accept more responsibility in Western institutions with Western values and conditionality as we define them. So if the Chinese are going to accept more responsibility, for example, as they are in being by far the biggest supporters of UN peacekeepers internationally, in a lot of parts of the world the Americans don't care as much about, it's going to be increasingly with their rules and their institutions. And that's the problem of both American and Chinese exceptionalism, is that there's not a lot of willingness to coordinate on these things. I don't believe that we're heading to the Americans and Chinese in any way looking at a G2, in any way looking to say how. The interesting thing about Munich this year was that the Europeans have no interest in making China their principal national security concern. The Americans, not just the Trump administration. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, too, that was absolutely number one. I've never seen this kind of division inside the transatlantic council.
In our last couple of minutes, I want to read just a line from Wolfgang Ischinger, who happens to be on the show, and ask each of you how you would avoid this bleak diagnosis. He writes, "The international order, mostly shaped by the West, is coming apart. And what emerges is not a more just or more peaceful order, but rather one in which those seem to prevail who do not seem to care about international law and norms, the age of impunity, as David Miliband has called it." So I agree with the diagnosis. I would like ideas from Munich or you or anyone on how you change gravitational forces and get into a better place. Wolfgang, this was your comment, you fix it.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I think the problem is that we on the European side have a very, very different philosophical view on what, patriotism and globalism means. In our view, these are not opposite concepts. In our view, you can be a European or a German patriot by embracing the idea of a global commons, the idea of strong international institutions. And I think the way forward for us on the European side is not to abandon, not to ignore the institutions, but to try, to do whatever we can to maintain, even as Brexit happens, to maintain a strong and vibrant and capable European Union, and to support the United Nations, and certainly to maintain NATO. That's what we need.
Danny Pletka?
Look, but this is a consistent theme of what we've just been talking about, which is that if values don't play a role in our national security policy, just as we need them to play a role in our national policy, then we are going to see this drift get worse and worse. We are going to see these failures of governance that Ian talked about. We are going to see countries like China, like Russia, like Iran, that do not value the same things that we do, that don't have the same values, that don't have the same principles, and that will not uphold this order that has frankly made us all hugely prosperous, right? That has made a better world for the last 70 years. If those are absent, then we will have no direction. We will have no North Star. And that's going to be a huge problem for us.
Yeah. It's the law of the jungle. And do you just quickly have any hope that among the many colleagues we know that they will somehow wake up and say this matters?
Look, it breaks my heart when I see two presidential candidates, one who's the sitting resident of the White House and one who's the Democratic frontrunner, neither of whom really care about human freedom. One who's trumpeting, the greatness of Fidel Castro, and the other one who seems more fond of Vladimir Putin than he does of Emmanuel Macron.
And for our global audience, that's Bernie Sanders.
Yes,
Right.
That's Bernie Sanders, who is the current frontrunner for the Democrats. That breaks my heart, because America has been the power that has stood for these things. The only hope that I have is one based on history. As Winston Churchill said, we like to try everything else out, but in the end, we generally do the right thing.
Ian, I'm going to give you the last word on how you would see us avoiding the direction of this sort of bleak diagnosis that Ischinger offered us.
The reason we've gotten to this position is in large part because we've forgotten about ourselves at home. We're not going to reinsert values in our national security and foreign policy if the majority of Americans feel that those values no longer apply to themselves here? So, I mean, the reason you have Bernie Sanders and the reason you have Donald Trump are symptomatic of decades of forgetting about the average American.
Right.
If we don't rebuild that, we're not going to reinsert values abroad.
I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Here in Washington, D.C., Danielle Pletka, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Ian Bremmer, President of the Eurasia Group, and in Berlin, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, Chairman of the Munich Security Conference. Thank you all. So what's the bottom line? Globalization used to be about connecting all of us, and the glue was trust. People, ideas, and institutions moved across borders with less friction. But walls are back. Populism and nationalistic narcissism are dividing us. Trust is collapsing, and unfortunately, fear is rising. Few see a way back to a world where leading nations work together to solve challenges like the global refugee crisis, like climate change impacts, and epidemics like the coronavirus. My panelists think that a combination of a need for a new order and values that respect human rights could make a comeback. But from my vantage point, not soon enough. And that's the bottom line.